Hello,
Hi, everyone.
everybody.
Welcome to Subtle Asian Book Club's first ever author discussion with the one and only R.F. Kuang. I'm Tiffany at Read by Tiffany.
I'm Alexandra at Twirling Pages.
And we are super excited. To have you all here today, especially Rebecca, because we have been reading the Poppy Word trilogy, I think in August and then September, and then now we're reading the final book, and everyone was just super excited for this event. So, Rebecca, if you'd like to introduce yourself really quickly, and then also maybe like share a quarantine fave, something that you've been loving or baking recently, because we see on Instagram that you're baking a lot, as like a quick little icebreaker.
Oh my god, I'm baking so much, but we're gonna try to go to the beach next week, so I'm trying to get my bikini body back. So I made like oatmeal chocolate chip cookies yesterday, and now they're just like sitting in a little box and I can't eat them. But yeah, hello, I'm R.F. Kuang. I wrote the Poppy Word trilogy, and the last book, The Burning God, just came out a couple months ago, and I'm now working on a new. Do you have a UK one?
Yeah, because I got it for Forbidden Planet. It took 2 months to arrive, though, but it's finally here.
Wow. I'm sorry it came so late, but I like the US ones better because my pick was purple and my UK publisher was just like, whatever, we won't listen to you. Anyways, did I answer the question?
I forgot.
Another fun quarantine fact about me is that, so like many good Asian kids, I did an instrument when I was little. I did 8 years of classical piano, and at the time I hated it, but we were getting so bored, my boyfriend decided that he wanted to learn to play the piano, which he is now just doing on his own somehow. So we got like a really nice 88 key, fully weighted keyboard, and I started playing again. And it's so weird because when I was a kid, I hated classical music. Like I thought I was just like, this is so boring. I don't know why anybody likes Mozart. Like I hate Beethoven, and now it's all I want to play, which worries me because it feels like I'm regressing and turning into, I don't know, like my mom. So that's what's going on with us right now. And Bennett's actually getting pretty good at piano, which is scary because he like did not know how to play 2 weeks ago.
That's impressive. I was a terrible piano student. My piano teacher, I have a really funny but kind of extreme story where before my piano test, my piano teacher was like cramming in a lesson for me, even though she was pregnant. And then she was having contractions during my lesson because she was scared I was going to fail the exam.
No.
Yeah. And then I think it's funny when you talk about classical music because both Zan and I grew up dancing ballet together. And then now it's like something that brings me back when I listen to it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Dude, I used to think people who like classical piano were like snotty and pretending, and now I like listen to classical music when I run. Like my running playlist is just Mozart, and I can't explain it. It just is very calming and makes me very happy now. And I hope it's not just me going crazy.
Well, now I need to try listening to classical music while exercising. Be like, Mozart, a banger.
So why don't we dive into the reason why everyone's here today? And also, just as a preface, this live is going to have massive spoilers, so please go away if you have not finished the book or if you're okay with being spoiled. But everyone's obviously like in shock about the ending. Everyone just talks about how, R.F. Kuang, pay my therapy bills. Could you talk a little bit about the significance of the ending as it relates to maybe like modern day politics? And just for some context, like I personally predicted that like naja would go to Spear because that's what happened with Chiang Kai-shek when he retreated to Taiwan. And I think when I was talking to Zan about it, she was like, "Oh, Rick's not gonna die because Mao Zedong's alive."
Yeah, I didn't see the ending coming, even though I was like, technically in terms of plot, it would make most sense for Rin to die. But then in history, that didn't happen. So then, yeah.
Yeah, obviously the ending of The Burning God is where the plot line diverges most from what happened historically. And that's just because what happened historically is not very interesting because we know what happened and we're living with the after effects of what happened, and they are scary, and it doesn't take a fantasy novel to point out the terrors of the current PRC regime, the ways in which Xi Jinping has only consolidated more and more power, the things he's doing with it. I mean, I think while we were all distracted with the Georgia election, they arrested like pretty much every pro-democracy Hong Kong activist, and no one said anything because we're all like, Ossoff, Warnock, so you know that sucks. And like there was a tweet a couple days ago where some Chinese like foreign propaganda mouthpiece was like, oh, the concentration camps are so good for Uyghur women because we're saving them from being baby making machines. And that caught a lot of flack, but I'm getting sidetracked. Anyways, so there was no reason, right, for the end of the book just to end with the rise of the PRC, because that's already laid out in historical record. I think a much more interesting question is asking the counterfactual of what could have happened to China if 1949 had gone differently, if the KMT had won the Chinese Civil War, or come to power in some way right after it, because it opens up a really complicated question for like post-coloniality and decolonial theory, which is what does the future look like for previously colonized areas? And China was not properly colonized by the West, right? But it felt the effects of Western imperialism and like was almost colonized by the Japanese. And that's complicated, right? Because I think there's a very naive perspective, which is just that the colonizer loses, you win the war of liberation, the West is pushed out, the imperialists are gone, and suddenly you can go back to normal, right? Like you can go back to whatever great civilization you had before. But the problem in the case of China was that regime was not great, right? If the question is, oh, we push out the Western imperialists and go back to the system of government we had, that's the Qing government, which was repressive, backwards, and was not equal for a lot of people, including peasants, including women. Like during the May 4th revolution, points were made. People had legitimate grievances. But then what does the future look like, right? What does modernity look like outside of the influence of the colonizer? And that's a question that people are still trying to answer today. I'm reading this pretty good book called Asia in Theory, and I'm blanking on the name of the author right now. But the argument basically is that even Taiwan, right, and definitely even mainland China are still struggling with the shackles of the imperialist influence and the mindset of colonialism, and proper decolonization is going to take much more than simply winning a battle or claiming that we've liberated ourselves. It requires like a cold, hard look at what are we defining as national identity? How are we treating indigenous populations within the country, right? Like how are we defining ourselves next to our regional allies? So it's a whole hot mess. And I think that's why the ending of The Burning God is both challenging and doesn't deliver the satisfying, like tidy wrap up that people might have wanted, because it's not clean and easy, right? Like Rin can't just win and walk away, but neither can it end on a fully tragic note. It ends on a if maybe we don't know, because like right now we really don't know. So it opens up the space for a lot more questions than it answers, which I've been trying to do with the whole trilogy, and I think people have resonated with and understood. So I'm pretty happy with the ending, but I realize that it doesn't close as many loops as people want.
I think with the both of us read it, we were like, this is the ending that makes the most sense. And also when you were talking about like the whole colonization thing, like just this whole week I've been listening to my grandma. She'll be listening to Taiwanese news and talking about how like we were colonized by the Dutch and then the Japanese, and then it's just the whole thing.
Yeah, for sure. I think like it makes the most sense because like you said earlier, it's very, very messy and we have to live in a mess right now. So then if it were to end in like a really clean cut way, it wouldn't make sense at all. So then this is, even though it is painful to experience, it is personally, I really love the ending.
So the frustration I have with a lot of fantasy novels is that they seem to have this really juvenile and naive attitude towards revolution, I think, and the ends of wars, especially when trilogies wrap up and it's like, and we defeated the evil party and we won the battle and everybody went home and the king was restored, or and suddenly we had a democracy. And it's like, that's not how it works though, right? Like, even especially revolutionary narratives, right? Like, it's like, okay, you won, so set up a socialist regime, like, do it, I dare you. It's very hard, and history tells us this, and I'm fascinated to see how you fall apart. But there's just this assumption, right, that there will be this smooth transition of power, and, you know, the country will start running again, ignoring the fact that there are entrenched bourgeois interests that aren't just going to go away. And I want to tear my hair out every time I read the end of a trilogy, and it's like, yeah, and then, you know, that's all. We can focus on like who married who and who had whose babies, and it's like, but that's just not how it works.
I also think it's interesting within this book that you talk about, even though the war's over, there's the aftermath of everyone's been impacted by the war, so no one's farming, everyone is like a refugee now, that it causes like the Great Chinese Famine in real life history, and also I guess like a parallel within this book too.
That was something that that was a lesson that I learned very well during my China during World War II class with Professor Hans van der Ven at Cambridge, where I thought we were just going to talk about military strategy and, you know, how Chongqing dealt with Japanese air bombing. But instead, we read book after book about the decades-long aftershocks of war, right? Like what happens when entire populations have to pick up and move miles and miles away, are displaced from their homeland. It means that they can't grow crops. It means that those areas are decimated. It means famines for cycles to come, and wartime disease, and the impact of air bombs, for example, on local populations. So it's so messy, and it doesn't wrap up cleanly, and it takes a massive concerted effort on the part of the government to restore things back to normal after war ends. And especially with imperialist wars, right? Like we're watching The Five Bloods by Spike Lee a couple weeks ago, which is a really amazing film, but spoiler alert if you haven't seen it. Like a recurring plot device is that there are landmines, right? Like people keep stepping on landmines. Characters keep getting decimated by landmines. They're decades after the war, and there's a nod to this in The Burning God when they're sailing down the river, and Daji is reflecting on landmines and weapons used by the Hesperians during their civil war that are still buried beneath the dirt that people are still suffering from. So yeah, war leaves trauma that doesn't go away for generations, and it's just so weird when you see wars wrap up so tidily and nicely in fantasy. I was gonna say a book that I actually think deals with this really well is The Lord of the Rings, when like after everything is settled at Mordor, right? Like it's not in The Return of the King, which makes me sad, but like the movie version. But in the book, it ends with Frodo going back to the Shire, which is on fire. And it's not even like there are orcs in the Shire. It's not like there's another huge baddie that they have to deal with. It's the local coup that has occurred, right? Like there are local baddies who now need to be dealt with. And it's the same thing for civil wars. There are local power gaps and vacuums, and people who exploit those vacuums and exploit each other. And it's a million tiny hurts all across the country that have to be resolved and won't be resolved for a long time to come.
Yeah, I think we see this a lot towards the very end of The Burning God. Not the very end, but like after Rin wins her battle with Naja, and she's like, oh, I won, and she's like in denial, and she's like, we didn't win, there's another war. And then everyone else around her is like, calm down, you need to, there's like a lot of other problems, there's famine, and there's like all these other things you need to focus on. She's like, no, it's not over, you guys are going insane, even though it's like the opposite. And then eventually we get to the end.
And part of the reason why she has this sense that the war is not over is because the Battle of Arlong just feels too easy, right? Like no real sacrifices were made. They went in planning to kill the dragon, and they obviously did not kill the dragon. No one was able to kill the dragon, and Rin only wins, right? Because Naja takes the fall and calms the dragon and sends it away, and in doing so surrenders everything to Rin. So that's why she's convinced, right, he has something else up his sleeve, because she didn't win the country properly in any real show of strength. She won it because somebody else was willing to sacrifice more for the country than she did, which really, turns into the big ending in the last chapter.
We had some people ask if you wanted to talk about Venka's ending.
Yeah, so I think that Venka's ending is confusing for a lot of people because they don't know the history that it's based on. But it was fun for me to do the historical homage, not writing the death scene, which is that near the, well, not near the end of his life, but later on during his regime, Mao was beset with deep paranoia, which culminated in the Cultural Revolution, which was his attempt to regain power. But he started distrusting a lot of people close to him, including Lin Biao, who was a general who basically handed Mao the North during the Chinese Civil War, which is exactly what Venka does for Rin during the Nicara Civil War. But then Rin's paranoia sets in, right? And at one point, Venka utters a phrase, which is exactly the same as a phrase that Naja uses in a letter to her, and Rin becomes convinced that Venka is the traitor. And so I had this planned for a while, because on the face of it, it's hard to explain why Venka gives up everything at the end of the Dragon Republic, just to go with Rin, right? My agent was like, this is odd because these aren't Venka's people. She's not from the South. She grew up with Naja. Like all her family, everything she knows is in Arlong. Why is she going? And it's pretty obvious why Venka's going, which is that she fought a war against an enemy that she hates, and it has become apparent to her that the Dragon Republic is not interested in dealing with that enemy, is in fact letting that enemy, which is the Federation of Mugen, continue to wreak havoc in the South in the interests of leading a civil war against Sudaji. So those are Venka's genuine reasons for leaving with Rin. But on the face of it, right, like Venka is this pretty privileged northerner, so it's easy to suspect that she might still be allied with Naja. So that connection is really easy to draw, and there are a lot of deliberate moments throughout the book where Venka knows things, or refers to things, or doesn't give correct information, like when Rin is asking, "Where's Naja?" and Venka's like, "Oh, he's sick. He's super sick. He's not going to be showing up anytime soon." And then Naja shows up in like the next chapter and drops bombs on them. And there are multiple ways that you can interpret them. The first is that Venka really didn't know, which is valid because Naja was undergoing a lot of experimentation, and obviously he would have been ill because his parents were doing terrible things to his body. Another interpretation is that Venka knew exactly what was going to happen, and she was misleading Rin. And it's deliberate that there is no correct reading textually. You can read it either way. There are arguments for either interpretation, so the reader's never supposed to know, just as Rin never knows, because Rin is an unreliable narrator and you only get everything fed through her perspective. But it's really sad, right? Because Venka's the one other female protagonist in the series. She's the one other woman that Rin could really believe. Well, kind of there are two. There's Daji, which is a whole other weird relationship. But then there's Venka. But a big tragedy of the trilogy is that Rin is never able to find true companionship or build a true alliance with either. And that speaks to her isolation and paranoia and the trauma that she's been through. Anyways, I've lost track of the question again.
I think that explains a lot. And because I feel like oftentimes people or readers tend to ask questions that are like, oh, but what happened? But then ultimately, like there are multiple ways to read it. And with a narrator like Rin, because she's really unreliable, there are a lot of things where it's like, oh, I don't know if this was actually true or if Rin's perception of it made it seem this way.
Yeah, I mean, as a reader, right, like all I want to know is the actual historical record. I demand clear answers from the author. So if I were reading The Burning God, I would be like, okay, well, stop fucking around. Just like tell us if she was the traitor or not. But what I'm trying to do with the books is show the unreliability of the historical record, through the fact that Rin is an unreliable narrator and everything is filtered through her gaze, but secondly, through the constant myth making that goes on throughout the trilogy, right? Like people are told so many different and contradictory versions of what the Spearly Queen was like, for example, or what the trifecta was like, or what happened to them. And by the end, Rin finally gets it, which is the point, which is that it doesn't matter which version of the story is correct. It matters which version of the story you create and which one you propagate about yourself. And she starts creating her own myth. So it's about myth making and control over history and memory, which is why in Rin's version, Venka is the traitor, and that's what she acts on, and that's what she has to believe. So sorry if you like tidy endings. I like on this subject, I kind of feel like Christopher Nolan, whenever people ask him, like, does the top really fall at the end of Inception? And I think the top falls over. And he's like, well, if I were just going to give an answer, I would have put it in the movie. The fact that I did it means that that's part of the artwork, right? Like you're not supposed to know, which is hard to sit with, but easier to sit with if you're the writer.
Yeah.
So that's a good segue into, we're like looking at our list of questions and we're like, damn, all of your comments can like be into any questions, so we're trying to figure out which one to ask.
Like there's so much to talk about. Okay.
So a good segue for that is that you talk a lot about like political storytelling, and especially within this book, one notable scene for me was when Suji's like public execution and Daji just constantly berating at Rin, like you have to make yourself into a legend. Can you talk a little bit about like those themes of like war and then like getting power and how it differs from the first two books then?
Yeah. The way I thought about Rin's relationship to power throughout the trilogy was that in the first book, she is unwittingly somebody else's tool. She just wants approval. She just wants to get through this war, and she has no idea what other figures are on the geopolitical chessboard, like pulling the strings behind the scenes. And in the second book, she understands that she's a pawn. She understands that other people are using her, but she just doesn't care because she doesn't want to take responsibility for her own power. She doesn't know how to play the game. And there is a sense of removing the guilt from her actions if she just lets herself be treated as a weapon. So she thinks life's going to be easier for her if she works for Viceroy, and obviously gets betrayed at the end of the Dragon Republic. So the third book was the most fun to write because it's the one where she finally comes into her own power. It's when she's finally calling the shot and making decisions. And it's really fun when she has conversations with Jiang and Daji about it, especially where they're like giving her like how to be a dictator 101 chats, where they're like, oh no, honey, just take an army. If you don't have one, just take it. What's wrong with you? And she's like, but don't I have to like, be nice to them and cooperate? And they're like, no, just like walk in there and pretend it's yours. And like, this is something that she has to practice and become good at. So in the scene where she finally wrestles back control over the Southern Coalition and turns it into the Southern Army, her army, because there's nobody to be in a coalition with, she finally gets it. She finally gets that she can't share power. Inherently, she has to be the only one calling the shots, or somebody else is going to try to subvert her at every turn. So the scene where she has Soji pulled, like decimated by a crowd, is a parallel to the scene during, or not the scene, the historical episode during the Long March, where so Mao started off the Long March in contention for power with several other communist figures. He ends it in complete control over the Chinese Communist Army, and that entire political movement. And he does it by backstabbing and seizing control and pushing the blame onto others, which is exactly what Rin does. So it doesn't really matter if Soji betrayed them, right? Like the truth doesn't matter, the facts doesn't matter. What matters is that Rin can present herself as this flaming phoenix, this symbol of hope as their savior, and she looks so good, right? Because she has like fire coming out of, like, she can make wings of flame or whatever. And it's also important symbolically that Soji is destroyed in that way in front of an entire crowd, because she doesn't want to have lingering misgivings about true loyalties, right? She doesn't want there to be some possible coup simmering in their ranks. So the violence does two things. The first is that participating in the violence is a way of demonstrating your loyalty, and working a crowd up into that frenzy is a way of awakening this base animalistic instinct. So because if you kill for someone, you're loyal to them. Like that act cements you to their agenda. But it's also signaling to everybody who might oppose her that if you defy me, this is what's going to happen to you. And this use of violence, right, is something that Mao understood really well, something that was used throughout the Cultural Revolution, this performative violence, both to signify your loyalty and to terrify anybody who wasn't completely on your side. It's something that the Chinese Communist Party is extremely good at. So it's something that was important for Rin to learn to wield.
Since Ren is known to be a direct parallel of Mao, how did you find a balance, or did you find a balance between the historical parallels and like the storyline and what you had in mind for the story?
Yeah, I think it's easier to explain Rin's relationship, I guess, to Mao by seeing it in terms of the questions that Mao raises rather than the life that Mao lived. Because Rin is really different from Mao in a lot of ways. They have, I think, completely separate personalities. Rin is not a sexual creep. She's just less boorish and gregarious and less of a megalomaniac, I think, than Mao was. I really tried to make her the most sympathetic version of Mao possible. But the questions that Mao raises, right, including how does somebody go from being basically a backwater nobody to the most important person in a country responsible for the death of millions, which is, I've said again and again, the inspirational question for the entire trilogy. But also, lots of other questions, like when you have that much power, when you have that much control, who can you trust? How are you making the decisions? Like, what are people telling you? How can you trust the information that you're being given, etc.? And also questions of loyalty and the people around you. The Rin-Kitai relationship is modeled heavily on the Mao Zedong Zhou Enlai relationship, and that creates questions about Kitai's complicity and the fact that I think somebody once described him as a walking Geneva Convention, is his entire personality, which is fair. But Kitai gets corrupted. I think you can't work with somebody like Mao or Rin for as long as Kitai and Zhou Enlai did and not slowly become corrupted by their ethical perspectives. And that's exactly what happens to Kitai. So how does history judge him? And how, if Zhou Enlai could have made amends for what he did, how would he have done it? And does Kitai find that kind of redemption? So those are the questions, right, that you get from Mao's biography that I think I answered in a more interesting way in the Popular trilogy.
We get to see Ren's character do kind of, not a full circle, but we see her going from like pawn to leader and then student to teacher. We get to see new characters like Papaji and Dulin. Did you always envisioning this coming full circle with her becoming a teacher one day?
Yeah, I like circles and triangles and symmetry. I think that my books are pretty predictable because I like geometry so much, and I really like it when things come back to the start. So there's a couple of things to tease out there, but I think most importantly, to start with, the Rin Jiang relationship at the start of the Poppy War was kind of the core, at least for the first 2 acts of the novel. And it's such an important relationship, not just in the book, but also I think in Chinese storytelling, like the student-master relationship in so many kung fu films, right? Like that's the background of those stories, the student's loyalty towards the master's responsibilities towards the student. And you get so many plot lines that hinge on one of them failing those obligations. And I know I've said this a bunch of times, but I love Kung Fu Panda so much. And the reason why is because the core storyline, which is just that the master fails his obligations to a former student who goes bad, who has to like come back and fight the current student, and the master has learned from his lessons. And it's all just so perfect.
It's so cute too.
But like it's a cute movie, but it's actually like a really old and complicated and I think tragic storyline. So you see echoes of that in the Poppy War, right? Like Alton was the former student, Jiang did badly by him. Rin is his second chance. Obviously, like Rin and Alton don't have to fight each other. They fight more in her psyche than they ever do in real life. But it's just that same question of what happens when the master does not teach their student as well as they should, when they don't protect them, when they haven't been the figure for them that they need to be. And John really shirks these responsibilities in the Poppy War. Like he just goes back into stone because he doesn't want to deal with everything else. But then he comes back in the Burning God, right? And then finally you get to see things come full circle between Rin and Jiang, where you find out that horrible backstory, you realize everything that Jiang Ziya did. But then Jiang ends up sacrificing his life so that Rin can get away. Which I think is finally a moment where Jiang is the person that Rin needs, because Rin's like entire exactly. I mean, like Rin's entire storyline can be defined by mentors who have failed her, right? Because they keep either abandoning her or manipulating her or taking advantage of her or just treating her like a worthless pawn. And finally, Jiang is not doing that, but sacrificing something for her. So that was a very satisfying narrative arc to close. And then the inverse of that is that Rin becomes a terrible teacher to a couple other poor kids. But that's less about the teacher storyline than about the abuse and trauma storyline. And a very recurring theme here is that trauma and abuse are cyclical, and people who have suffered violence at the hands of monsters often turn around and inflict that same violence again. But wow, I'm just realizing now how much I love the circles, because now I'm realizing that in the last chapter of The Burning God, there's literally a line that's like, history moves in such vicious circles. But like importantly, right, like I didn't want to end on a pessimistic note, which was that if you are abused, you are necessarily an abuser, because Rin sees that almost happening with Kitai when he says, "You're hurting me," and that's it for her. She can't do that, and she has to break the cycle and not be a circle. So yeah. So despite my love for circles, importantly, it was finally broken.
Yeah,
Go.
I was
gonna say, I thought it was so interesting how you're saying that like when Jiang sacrifices himself, he is like finally the good leader. But then sorry, I had to pull out the book, but like her last quote to him when she gives him a funeral is like, "You were always such a fucking coward," which is such a stark contrast.
Well, Rin's not in a good place
That's
at
true.
that moment. Yeah, so the first version of that funeral scene was a lot sappier, because I wanted Rin to have more than a faint inkling that Jiang might figure more in her past than she realizes. But then I thought it was better just to keep her totally clueless. But also I thought about her like acknowledging everything Jiang had done and realizing that somebody had finally done something good for her. But I think that emotional catharsis would have happened too early in the book, because at that point she's operating from a place of rage at the trifecta. I've seen a lot of comments that it's startling how quickly the trifecta are just like wiped off the book. But that was always intentional for me because they are a red herring, right? Like you think they're going to be the saviors. You think they're going to figure a lot more largely in Rin's life than they do. But then she just gets rid of them and the entire Hesperian dirigible fleet, or at least most of it, in one fell blow. And it's such a moment of like finally taking control for Rin, because this whole, like, even throughout Act 2, she's been willing to share power with the trifecta. It's clear that Daji is trying to upseat her, but she doesn't seem super concerned about this. And Katai keeps warning her, we don't really know who this Riga guy is, and he could be awful, and you're going to have to cooperate with him. And she's like, it doesn't matter, right? Like, we just need a monster that we can ally ourselves with to take this country back. And it's finally on Mount Tianshan. And I know that Tianshan literally means like Tin Mountain, but you know what? It's for Western readers, so I'm not going to apologize for that. But so like in the temple, right? Like she's dealing with Riga, and then it finally clicks for her that she just can't share power. She can't do it. Not after everything that they've done. Not after hearing how he views her and her people. And she's like, fuck it, right? Like finally, I am determining the sequence of events for this country for the foreseeable future. And then she unleashes the flare, and then she has Naja shoot them. But yeah, so we were talking about Jiang. Right, so at that point, she's operating from a mental space of, fuck these guys, I don't need them. I thought they were going to help me, but they're not, and I have to do all of this alone. So it's important that she's suppressing her gratitude and other tender emotions for Jiang, because if she lets herself feel them, right, like she doesn't have the drive to go out and do what she does next. I guess emotional suppression is really the name of the game with Rin.
We saw some comments about the trifecta. Do you want to talk a little bit about the influences for them? I think I saw in an interview talked about like the journey to the west or investiture of the gods, and maybe how it differs again from like actual stories.
Yeah, sorry, I'm laughing because I think that, so there was an animated film called Naja that came out a couple years ago that people really liked, but the same production company, I think, is now making a Jiang Ziya film, and apparently Jiang Ziya is like really hot in it. So like people keep tagging me and like, have you seen the super hot Jiang Ziya? And I'm like, okay, but I did it first. But all these characters come from the investiture of the gods, the Fengshen Yanyi, which is just like batshit crazy. And Journey to the West is a lot of fun. The Water Margin is a lot of fun, but both of them, I think, are very tame and shockingly linear in comparison to the investiture of the gods, which I think is just unhinged and like doesn't really make a lot of sense, doesn't have a proper ending. Characters keep dying and then coming back magically, and there's no explanation. And it all starts, right, with the king deciding that the snail goddess Nirwa looks really hot and writing a lewd inscription on her temple. And then she gets mad and creates these like demonic creatures who take the form of beautiful women to go like seduce him and ruin his, like that's the whole start of the saga, which is crazy. So I thought it was very cool. So that's where you get Sudachi, which bears a lot of resemblances to the Daji, the evil concubine, and the investiture of the gods. And so Jiang and Daji are technically enemies in the investiture of the gods, but they have a very different relationship because the Jiang Ziya, the investiture of the gods, is this old wise guy, and the first time you meet him, he's just like fishing. And our Jiang is younger and cooler and crazier, I think. But yeah, so at least two legs of the trifecta come from the investiture of the gods. The third leg, Riga, is just an original invention. Just because I like triangles and I thought the word trifecta was very cool. So I wanted a third guy, and that's why Riga has been mentioned from the first book. So another thing I wanted to say about the trifecta is that it's interesting that people keep trying to draw parallels between the trifecta and Rin, Katai, and Naja, and I just don't think they super work. And it was never intended that they. So I think this obsession with like the legendary threesome and then like the new trio who are parallels of them comes from Naruto. I strongly believe this is because like in Naruto, right, like you have the sun and you have Orochimaru, Jiraiya, and what's her face, Tsunade, and then you have like Naruto, Sasuke, and Sakura, and they're like, oh, like they're all trained by one of them, and they're their successors, and it's like, but the Papa is not Naruto, and that just isn't how, like, there are like vague, weird parallels. I think like the best argument is that Rin is Rika, Kitai is Jiang, and Daji is Naja somehow. But I don't even remember the argument for that. But yeah, it just, sometimes the triangles are not identical triangles. They're just congruent triangles. I don't know if congruent means identical. They're similar, but they're different sizes.
Different geometric shapes. This is kind of a tangent, but then I feel like it's still kind of related because trifecta, experience, Hesperian rule, and we go really into Hesperians in this book. And so there's a moment in this book where Rin, Naja, Katai have like experiences of existentialism where they're like, how is it possible that Hesperians are so much more advanced in technology than they are? Are Nicodan Nicodans like really worse than them, and are Hesperians better? Was this personally difficult to write, or how do you think it was represented with the Asian mentality?
Yeah, that was not hard to write because I think that attitude is very understandable and very sympathetic. I've talked about Fanon before, but one of the foundational texts for the political and philosophical underpinnings of this trilogy is Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, which is a really good treatment of colonialism and especially the psychological impact of colonialism. And Fanon writes about the colonial mentality in which, like, the effects of colonialism are such that the mind suffers a fracture, the psyche is split, and begins to internalize the sense of inferiority, right? Which he documents in multiple case studies. And so it's not surprising that after prolonged exposure to the Hesperians, after living in the new city and being imprisoned there, Katai really starts to doubt whether the Hesperians are wrong about their theories of racial superiority. And I think another thing that complicates this is that we can't apply a black and white paradigm to colonial encounters in terms of knowledge exchange, because, for example, in the late Qing era and in the Republican era, right, there were a lot of Chinese scholars who were really enamored with the West. Kang Youwei, for example, who was a Qing era scholar and a proponent of reform and was never quite successful, like really advocated Western learning and learning from Western methods and technologies. And even in the Republican period, right, like you have Lu Xun, who is considered the father of modern Chinese literature, who went to Japan to study. And a lot of the Chinese intellectuals went to Japan to study. And a lot of what were seen as Western imports, science, democracy, individualism, etc., like a lot of those same concepts were championed during the May 4th movement. And I mean, I think there's a good argument that a lot of those things are good things, right? Like it is true that prior to the May 4th era, Chinese society and Chinese government was stultified and regressive and deeply hierarchical, patriarchal, etc. And a lot of those concepts that maybe came from the West, maybe would have arisen internally given time, did a lot to advance liberties for a lot of disenfranchised and marginalized groups. So then you get into more complicated questions of, do you have to buy into the entire regime of knowledge to accept those concepts? Or, right, like, do you have to buy into the Hesperian idea of of this racial ladder of the maker, right? Like the entire foundation upon which their scientific knowledge is built? Or can you accept the products of that research and that progress without accepting the rest of it? And this is an ongoing debate in decolonial studies. So I don't really have an answer, but it's just a lot more complicated than, like we are the colonized peoples and everything is perfect and wonderful with our knowledge regimes, which is not true, right? Like the Qing was deeply hierarchical in its own ways and also deeply racist. And so it's not just a question of like the good versus the evil and everything about the colonial powers being terrible, but it's about regimes of knowledge and what those encounters look like and how you build futures, liberating yourselves from the shackles of the colonial mindset while also, building on progress.
We also got a question pretty earlier on about Naja, if you want to talk a little bit about his character arc and like his rise or like being pushed into power because his visor dies in this book.
Wait, sorry, is there like a question about...
There was a question of just like if you could talk to Naja's character arc, but I lost it in the comments.
Yeah, I can't find it. Is it this one?
Maybe. There was like two, but we can go with this one.
Okay, so the question is, does Naja genuinely care for the Republic and for the Nakara people as independent people? And the answer is yes, he does. He has this sense of noblesse oblige, which is the aristocratic obligation to the lower peoples. So again, right, like all political philosophies are mixed bags, and Naja is the mixedest of bags. So he has a lot of very bad opinions. He is kind of a racist. He's deeply classist, definitely sexist, and just a bigot in every way possible. But he is also a Democratic Republican. And I think the best parallel for this is the way that we both celebrate and are also really quite a bit sus of a lot of Enlightenment era thinkers who are figuring out ideas of individualism, of rule by the people, of democracy for the first time. And, a lot of these writers, right, like Locke, were like, wow, like the divine right of kings is wrong. Like we have these like personal liberties, and at the same time they own slaves, right? So it's not that you suddenly see the light and freedom applies to everybody. It's patchwork incremental progress where more and more groups are fighting for liberation. So not just like barely half of the way there. He has a lot to work on, but he does genuinely have these commitments to governmental reform. It's just that those commitments are not enough. And the same applies to like every revolution across history that only enfranchised wealthy white men, right? Like it's far from being enough, but it is much better, I think, than the divine right of kings.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I really love how wonderfully messy this series is, because life is so messy, and like I feel like the diaspora identity is really, really messy as well. So for me and Tiffany personally, the Poppy War was in a lot of ways a reckoning for our lives, because much of Asian history is not something we grew up with, and then we got to learn more about Asian history because of the series. What did you hope for people to get out of these books, specifically The Burning God? And yeah.
I mean, I think just one general hope is that people are more interested in Chinese history, which I think I've been pretty successful at. I get a lot of requests for reading recommendations, and I always forget them, which is why they're printed at the end of the paperback of the Poppy War. But so to move beyond like a general understanding of what even happened historically. I think for the Chinese diaspora in particular, I want to open up a deeper and more complicated question of what do we do with the PRC? And so, okay, where do I start? All right, I think there are levels of being comfortable with being Chinese American. And I think the place where I started was just wishing I was white, which is where I was for a lot of elementary school and middle school, right? And then I think there comes a phase, which I think is easier to come into now with like social media groups like Subtle Asian Traits and just like a lot more online community where you learn to find others who are like you and have like a deep sense of Asian pride. And I finally got to that place in high school and college. But then past that, there are really difficult questions of what do you do with your pride in a country that perhaps your parents left because they were fleeing political repression. And my dad was a student at Beida in 1989, which is a large reason why we are here. And so he, deeply opposes the PRC. A weird effect of this is that a lot of Chinese immigrants who came after 89 are Republicans. They're deeply anti-socialist. They support politicians who are hard on China. And like, I get it, right? Like, I get why you would just be like, I, am pro-capitalism, just pro-political liberties. Because to them, like, the greatest terror was the repression of the PRC when they were young. But now, right, like, we're in a weird place where the US government is what it is. And I think it's difficult for Chinese Americans to accept all the criticism of the PRC, and because I think you fall into a couple of different camps. The first is just apologists for the PRC, which I think are just wrong. Like, we can't be in support of the things that the Xi administration does. And then there's, on the other camp, right, you're just like, go America. America is where everything is great. Like, everything about China is wrong. And this is also clearly, like, we are living through like a failed coup, right? And like, the place where I finally come to and this is also wrapped up with like, which country do you feel more allegiance to, right? Like, where do you feel like you belong? Which country do you feel like you support? And I finally come to a place where I'm like, hating policies that the PRC implements does not in any way reduce my love of Chinese people and China as a country, because Chinese people have done incredible things, like have made incredible achievements. And to be fair, the PRC regime has led to significant increases in the standard of living for a lot of people, right? Like, it's not a black or white judgment. I think like this is a thing we keep circling back to. You can't have just like a blank normative judgment on any regime. And it's very similar to my attitude towards the US, which is I love America and I love Americans, and America's deeply fucked up. And being able to criticize both and love both is hard and weird, but you have to be able to hold those contradictions and complexities in your mind, which is what The Burning God especially tries to do for the Chinese diaspora. It's not a book that just unapologetically celebrates Asia, because I assume we've gotten past that point. I assume that people who are reading these books are like, yeah, it's cool to be Asian, it's cool to be interested in Asian culture. The more interesting question is, how do we grapple with some of the horrors of Asian history, right? And the history of the very recent histories that our families have gone through. So I think that was a very long answer to the question of what I hope people get from the books, but I hope it opens up space for a more nuanced dialogue between Chinese Americans about where we come from and how we feel about that.
I think it's something that, I don't know, when both of us read this, the Burning God was the most like painful for me to read in terms of like grappling with my own internal struggle, because my family is from Taiwan pre-KMT, and Zan's family was also from like Shanghai, and then now we're here. So we had, I don't know, I get very opinionated about politics.
Yeah, I think it's
Yeah.
hard, right? Because people love to just generalize about you, and if you criticize China, they're like, "Oh, like you're an American, you hate China and you hate Chinese people." And it's like, okay, well, I hate the American government just as much. So, it's I think it's especially tough to have those conversations in online spaces like Twitter, where there's absolutely no nuance and a lot of red hot nationalism from both sides.
Yeah, for sure. I really appreciated the series because of that, because like I was able to like have open conversations about like, yes, I'm proud to be Chinese, but you have to acknowledge that China's done some really horrible things. And yes, I'm proud to be American, but look at the government right now. Like, is that something you should be necessarily proud of? So it's really messy, and I really love that. So, yay.
I think this book also allowed me to have more, not empathy, but understand a lot more where like the older generation of Asian Americans are coming from too. Because I think in the past I was just like, you're wrong. But obviously they have the reasons for why they're thinking that way.
Yeah, okay, I've told this story about my dad a couple times, but I want to keep telling it because it makes me really happy. My dad never voted for Obama. He voted for Romney. Not sure about McCain, but like he was one of those like post 89 like diehard Republicans, right? But the moment Trump got elected, it was like I remember the day after he sent me this really long text that was like, "I'm a liberal now. And as a liberal, here are some things that I believe." And it was just like a list of like the most like basic like liberal demands. He was like, "I believe that everyone has the right to like enough money to survive, like no matter how hard they're working, etc." And then he was like, "I believe that people should love who they want to." And I was like, "Oh, where did all this come from?" But I think for him and a lot of Chinese American voters like him, seeing what Trump is doing for America has reminded them what's really at stake, right? Like the political liberties that they came here seeking are truly under attack under Trump's America, and that has really changed things for them. So it's been fascinating watching my dad transform into like a democratic canvasser and activist over the last couple of years. Okay, he's gonna be mad at me for saying this, but sometimes he like sends me videos of himself, like just like they live in Colorado, so he's just like in the mountain wilderness, and he's like raising his fist, yelling like that out Chanze, which is like down with Trump the thief, and I'm like, whoa, Dad. But I'm like really proud of where he's come politically, and I think it's not just him, right? Like he has this whole circle of Chinese American democratic activists that he chats with on WeChat and gets into Twitter beef with. So I like see a real change going on with the older generation too, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, I definitely don't blame them anymore, because a lot of times the way they think or the way they do these things or have these opinions is mostly from like fear and trauma. And it's so hard to let go of that fear and trauma and like see clearly the way your dad is doing. So I'm like so happy for your dad. So happy for you.
So we're coming short on time, but we wanted to like wrap things up. If you wanted to talk a little bit about your Oxford novel, since some people are excited about it, congrats on submitting your manuscript.
Oh, I should have told you I didn't.
I'm just kidding, never mind.
It is far from done. The new deadline is April 1st, which is fine. I think I can do it. I will just have to work really hard for the next 3 months of the year. No, it's honestly going really well. It's just that I thought I had until May to finish it, but then my agent was like, the contract says January 15th. And I was like, that's a lie. That can't possibly be true. But it was true. So we asked for an extension and it's due in April. But so it's really, really different from the popular trilogy. It's different in tone and thematic focus. Because I've been reading a lot of Victorian literature, and I really like Dickens, and it's a pastiche of that genre, but it asks really complicated questions, I think, about being a student and the political role of students, and also student revolutions. It's inspired by my dad's time at Tiananmen and the student protests that we saw in Hong Kong over the last couple of years, and student revolutions across history, which is related to questions of the academy and injustices within the academy, as well as the obligations and indulgences and failures of people who are wrapped up in the ivory tower. Because I'm struggling with this a lot, especially now when we're going through a time of crisis, and I'm literally about to start my PhD in modern Chinese literature, which is a field that I struggle to connect to producing immediate material support for the people who need it most, right? And I think a lot of people in the humanities are struggling with this, and I don't want to live my life just reading books and having fun and being paid to do that. And I think we also need broader discussions of what the academy can do for communities in need. But I'm rambling at this point. It touches on a lot of stuff. I think it's going to be good. I think it's better than the Popular Trilogy, just because I'm older and know how to write better. So I will turn it in on April 1st, and then hopefully soon after that, we'll be able to do a title reveal and give out more details of what the book is actually about.
The Oxford
Yay.
novel.
We're so excited. In the meantime, are there any books by Asian authors that you're looking forward to in 2020?
Oh, hell yeah. So Nina Vo's novellas, which I've hyped up a lot in the past, The Empress of Salt and Fortune, I think, came out a little earlier this year, which is, When the Tiger Came Out in Mountain, which is a sequel to The Empress of Salt and Fortune. But they have a proper novel coming out this year called The Chosen and the Beautiful, which I think is just perfect. And it's a retelling of The Great Gatsby from Jordan Baker's perspective, who in this version is a queer Vietnamese American who can do magic. So it's already way, way better than the original Great Gatsby. And I believe that comes out in June. So be on the lookout for that. I have not read Shelley Parker Chan's She Who Became the Sun, but I'm told that it's really awesome
I just got an arc for it. I'm so excited.
I think I have an arc for it. I just have not gotten to it, which I should. But let me know how it is. I think that'll be really good. And it's been compared to Madeline Miller's Circe, which I really loved. So I'm really hyped for anything set in China and told in that style.
Amazing. And then, this is probably a long way off, but do you have any hopes of being involved in the TV show production?
I don't really want to. And this is a really long way off, so I'm not giving out information about conversations that have actually happened, but I'm just so busy. And so part of it is also I don't really like looking back. So I have done all the work in the world of the Poppy Ward that I wanted to, and I'm focused solely on future projects and new books. And I'm not a screenwriter, and I don't know anything about TV production. So I just I do want to be consulted on the important stuff, right? It's important to me that the cast is Asian, and that they are appropriately cast to their descriptions in the book. But beyond that, I just feel like the more I get involved, the more potential there is for heartbreak. So I am happy to distance myself from the TV show, and I hope it's really awesome. I don't really care if it's not. It's not my thing, right? It's a thing that they bought the rights for that they're making, and I'm just not really interested in doing that much work on it because, I'm a writer, and what I do is write books.
I hope we get to see you as an extra or something. That'd be cute.
My dad really wants to be an extra in one of the battle scenes. He keeps being like, I just, I can be in there for a couple of minutes. I can run really fast and wear armor and they can kill me, but I want to be in it. Which, if it ever gets made, I'm sure they will accommodate.
Awesome. So that is what we have, all the questions that we had prepared. Are there any lasting messages you want to give to your fans, people in the chat? Otherwise, we are good to go.
Just stay safe and take care of yourselves.
Yay. Circles.
Circles and triangles.
Thank you all so much for coming. In January or this month, we're currently reading These Violent Delights by Chloe Gong. And Chloe will also be joining us for a live show discussion at the end of the month. So we hope to see you there.
Yeah. Stay safe, and we hope you enjoy reading all the Asian books.
Bye.
Bye.